morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
We're going to get today started with conversations on CARICOM. A very interesting place to start is with Cuba-Barbados relations. So let me go right ahead and say good morning and welcome to Ambassador David Comissiong. I have to say good morning. I have to say it's good to see you. I have to say Happy New Year and all of that stuff. And I'm a little disappointed because while I was home, I saw you here on the couch, and now I'm back. You're there, and I'm here.
Yes, well, let me welcome you back, Tisha. It's good to have you back. On, Unfortunately, I'm in Jamaica, so I'm coming to you from the Pegasus Hotel room in Jamaica. I'm here as a guest of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So we are doing a retreat. We're doing some work on CARICOM's reparations agenda. But as soon as I'm back in Barbados, I will be there live and direct rather than virtual. But last week, I was in Cuba. I spent the last 10 days of the month of January in Cuba. And I took the opportunity to try to follow up on the Barbados-Cuba cooperation agreement. We have a Barbados-Cuba cooperation task force, and I'm in charge of the Barbados side of the task force. So coming out of the CARICOM Cuba Summit in December of 2022 that was held in Barbados, and the Barbados-Cuba bilateral meeting that was coincided with the summit, we have a cooperation agenda with Cuba. We are focusing on 10 different areas of cooperation. And so I am paying very close attention to how those areas are being implemented. In addition to that, I was in Cuba as a guest of the Cuban news agency, Prensa Latina, and they were looking at all of the challenges to do with news reporting in the world today, all the propaganda, the fake news, the anti-Cuba propaganda, etc., the propaganda around the assault on the Palestinian people in Gaza. And I also was very fortunate that my visit to Cuba coincided with the Havana Jazz Festival. I was able to see a little bit of Keisha Christian's performance, and I was able to visit some of the attractions of Havana that I think the Barbadian people really need to go to Cuba to experience. So it was a very packed visit, Keisha, and we can discuss any aspect of it that you would like to focus on.
All right, wonderful. It's great to hear that there are so many discussions happening around what's happening globally. But let's talk about the relationship with Cuba and Barbados directly. What are you working on in that area to continue the diplomacy that has been going for so many years and working so well to the benefit of both countries, really?
Yeah, well, just to re-emphasize for Barbadians, CARICOM has a very special relationship with Cuba. Every single independent CARICOM country has an embassy in Cuba, and likewise, Cuba has an embassy in every single CARICOM country, and that's very unique. You don't find that with any other country, that kind of relationship. Also, every 3 years, we have a CARICOM Cuba summit where all the heads of government come together. So, coming out of the last summit, we established this joint Barbados-Cuba cooperation agreement. So, education, tourism, health, sports, agriculture, biotechnology. I mean, some of the areas that I find very exciting. As you would know, Barbados is in the process of establishing, well, not just one life sciences farm, but eventually several life sciences farms and life sciences parks, sorry. And the intention is for, Cuba has done very, very well in the whole area of genetic engineering and biotechnology. And so when I was in Cuba, I was able to visit Cuba's Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. And it was so exciting to know that they will be part of the building out of our life sciences industry in Barbados. They have pioneered some cutting edge medications in the health sphere. We are very interested in their hepaprop P this drug. This is a drug that is used to treat diabetic ulcer. Diabetic ulcer is what typically leads to many Barbadians suffering amputations of their limbs. And right now, with the Ministry of Health, we are working on bringing Heberprop P to Barbados, have it registered in Barbados, so it is available for Barbadians suffering from diabetic ulcer. But because Cuba is under this embargo, and because Cuba is under this embargo from the United States, for example, Cuban medications are not registered by the American Food and Drug Administration, etc. We have to go through a process of doing our own study in relation to the medication so that it can satisfy our requirements, our legal requirements for registration in Barbados. So right now we are working on that, the Ministry of Health, Export Barbados as well, and we're very excited about that. Cuba's also developed things like a vaccine for lung cancer. And you know, one of the most inspiring things of my visit, Tisha, was that visit to the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, and hearing the presentation and hearing the Cuban specialists say that, look, if Cuba can only withstand this U.S. blockade, and if this system that Cuba has developed for itself of genetic engineering and biotechnology, if that system can remain intact and continue on the trajectory that it is on now, producing new cutting edge treatments and medications, they are predicting that by the year 2050, cancer will no longer be a killer disease, that it will be a chronic disease that you can live with, that can be treated with medications. So that is the kind of scientific powerhouse we have in the Caribbean. But a lot of Cuba's potential is actually being held back by the fact that they have to struggle with all of these sanctions from the United States. So in the area of trade, part of our cooperation agreement with Cuba is to implement the second protocol of the CARICOM Cuba trade agreement. So we have Export Barbados, we have the Vision of Foreign Trade in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working on trying to get Barbadian exporters to get their products into Cuba. But the blockade is making it very difficult. You know, problems with transportation to Cuba, problems with Cuba having foreign exchange, you know, to pay for the imports, late payments because of Cuba's difficulties with the U.S. Embargo. But we are forging ahead. As I said, sports. We have had this collaboration with Cuba with training in sports since 2003. There are 8 disciplines, from athletics to boxing, swimming, you know, to a host of disciplines where we have had Cuban coaches in Barbados for over 20 years now. And in terms of the new agreement, we are going to be helping Cuba to develop cricket, road tennis, and netball. So we will be sending coaches to Cuba in these 3 areas. And we have also agreed that in the sports of beach volleyball and basketball, that we're gonna develop a special bilateral competition between Barbados and Cuba, where we play these games. We do these contests against each other in beach volleyball and basketball. So many areas, Tisha, that we are really trying to push ahead with, but we are doing it against the background of that U.S. blockade that makes life very difficult for the Cuban people, and that's part of our diplomacy as well. To the whole of CARICOM, we continue to reach out to the United States government to say, look, this blockade is counterproductive, not only for Cuba, but for all of us in the CARICOM area. Please, please remove it. But so far, we have not been successful.
Well, tell us the ways that you are able to reach out to share how CARICOM feels collectively about this blockade and how it's impacting Cuba's progress. Is it only when you attend some of these international conferences? Is it by by correspondence that you send, various meetings that are held? How is this communicated?
Well, CARICOM has tried everything from a collective private letter of our heads of government to President Biden, explaining to him very rationally and reasonably why this blockade is anachronistic and why it needs to go, to voting every year. Every year in the United Nations General Assembly, there's a resolution condemning the blockade and calling upon the United States to remove it. And every year, for the last 30 years, CARICOM unanimously we vote for that. Whenever we get a chance to engage with US diplomats, for example, at the last Summit of the Americas, when our heads of government had a chance to meet with President Biden and Vice President Harris, we continue to make the point in every possible fora, remove the blockade. Not only is it illegal, but it is harming the development, not only of Cuba, but of the entire Caribbean region. And just sometimes just trying to share information as to why the blockade should be removed. So, for example, during the course of last year, I discovered that in 1975, the government of the United States actually voted in the Organization of American States to remove the OAS's blockade against Cuba. So the OAS had followed the United States back in 1964, and they too had imposed a blockade on Cuba. But in 1975, the United States said, look, this blockade is counterproductive. We are voting to remove this OAS blockade against Cuba. And in any case, it is the will of the majority of nations of this hemisphere. We don't need this blockade. And the US actually voted to remove the OAS blockade. And that was a Republican administration. So I've been trying to share that information with the US Congress people and so forth. That look, in 1975, a Republican administration was able to vote to remove a blockade against Cuba. What is so difficult now in 2024? Particularly, you have a Democratic administration in office. What is so difficult with removing this almost identical blockade? You know, the logic that applied in 1975 still applies now. It is counterproductive, and it is the will of the vast majority of nations that it goes. So we try every way that we can, because a central plank of CARICOM's foreign policy is solidarity with Cuba. But the blockade remains a reality, and so that is why we have these cooperation agreements, because we have to try to work around the blockade now. So we have to try to, redouble our efforts to have these mutually beneficial relations with Cuba, and somehow find our way around the blockade. So it's not that we can't do it. It's just that the blockade makes it a little bit more difficult to develop these relations with Cuba.
What's happening on the ground in Cuba, though? I know that you mentioned that there's much talk about what's happening across the globe. Is there any impact that they can see, and how are they reacting to all that's happening in terms of what's happening in the Middle East and in Europe and things of that nature?
Well, on the ground, Cuba is struggling with the hardships arising from the blockade. You see it a lot in the transportation sector. So getting access to gasoline. Sometimes vehicles have to line up for hours to fill up that tank, gas tank. You see it with people on the streets waiting for public transportation. So yes, and the whole strategy is to make life as miserable as possible for the people, and try to get the people to turn against their government. So that is what the Cubans are dealing with. But Cuba is, it's a very well organized society, and it's a society that has a sense of internationalism. So it is always very much in tune with what is happening internationally, and trying to play a constructive role in international affairs. So um, lots of concern about Gaza, lots of solidarity with the Palestinian people, and the reason I went was to be part of this conference where you had journalists from over 30 countries who were brought to Cuba, who came to Cuba to discuss these kinds of international issues. I mean, Gaza, Gaza kind of stole the show because everyone is very concerned about what is happening to the people of Palestine, and all of the difficulties with making sure that propaganda doesn't rule the international media, fake news, and that countries like Cuba, countries that are in a sense, find themselves on the wrong side of these powerful Western powers, are not victimized through misinformation and propaganda. So the idea was, how can all these 30 countries, and how could the journalists and the news sectors all work together to make sure that there's fairness and balance in news across the world, you know. And I think Tisha would like to say a little bit too about not just about Barbados, Cuba, but about CARICOM Cuba relations, because Cuba is doing some very important projects with CARICOM. I guess the most substantial one is this: the Cuba and CARICOM has collaborated in Guyana to establish a center for the stimulation of the development of children and adolescents with special educational needs. And that center has been in operation for a couple of years now. But I don't think most Barbadian or Caribbean people are aware of this. But yes, there is this very important educational institution that has been developed with Cuban technical expertise, and is located in Guyana, and it provides this very important service for our Caribbean region. In addition, Cuba is also helping CARICOM with its food security, because, as you know, we have this 25 by 25 food production project in CARICOM, and Cuba was invited to sit on the ministerial council that oversees that entire project. And so Cuba is not only is Cuba on the ministerial council, but Cuba is also playing a role in helping us beef up our food production in CARICOM. Cuba is also working with CARICOM on establishing a school of the arts, a Caribbean School of the Arts, and that is slated to be established in Jamaica. So, those are just some of the critical areas that we continue to have collaboration on with Cuba as a region.
All right, so definitely lots happening. Now, during my recent travels, I met a new Cuban friend, and he told me that the high school he went to in Cuba was named for a Barbadian national hero. I told him I would ask you. I wasn't sure.
And I didn't know, and I haven't heard that. But I tell you what, I want to, as part of our cooperation program, Prime Minister Motley indicated that the Barbados government would allocate $1 million every year to finance an exchange, a youth and artists exchange program with Cuba. And having gone to Havana in January and gone to places like the Fidel Castro Ruse Center, which is a new center that tells the whole story of the life of Fidel Castro, very high tech, very interactive, and features an interactive segment that features Fidel's 3 visits to Barbados, and tells you everything about his visits to Barbados, the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. I also visited the newly refurbished Cuban Capitolio building, a magnificent building that houses Cuba's parliament and so forth. And I am very, very keen for Barbadian young people, and I'm thinking of school groups as well, to actually go to Cuba and to experience these things. I am very keen for our young science students to go and visit the Center for Genetic Engineering, and get that inspiration. So these are some of the things that we are going to be working on. In fact, I've already gotten the Cubans to put together a program for visits of groups of young Barbadians, and I'll be introducing that to the Ministry of Education and to selected secondary schools. So there's just so many areas. There's just so many areas. I mean, about 20 years ago, I was involved in taking a group of 65 young Barbadian musicians to Cuba. They spent a month in Cuba studying at Cuba's National School of Music. And today, some of the most outstanding professional musicians that we have in Barbados are members of that group of 20 years ago. I think it was a life-changing experience for many of them, 12, 13, 14 years old. And several of them made the commitment then to become professional musicians. So that is the richness. That is the richness of a Cuban experience. And I've come back to Barbados. I've come back very energized to really make sure that this Barbados-Cuba collaboration program works in a very concrete way, that it is implemented in a very concrete way.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm being told by my crew in the back that the school has Barbados in the name or something like it. But
Okay. We'll double check. I'll ask my Cuban counterparts to let me know.
Yeah, and we'll figure that one out. But thank you. Travel well. Look forward to hearing more about the reparations discussions that are taking place, particularly on hearing the announcement from the governor of New York that they've secured hundreds of millions of dollars for victims of the Holocaust and their heirs in reparations. Very, very interesting. So we look forward to hearing from you and your discussions coming up. Travel safely.
I'll be there to give a report next week. Thank you. Thank you, Tisha.
Morning, morning, morning.